Welcome to the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping physicians in Michigan turn their professional success into financial success while enjoying life along the way. And now, here are your hosts, Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Physician's Guide to Financial Wellness. This is Trent DeBruin, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Andrew Mushbaugh. And today we're going to talk about a common question we come across when people are looking to get a new car, which is whether it's better to buy or lease. As with most things in financial planning, there are many different aspects to consider, and there isn't a universal black and white right answer, but it instead depends on the specifics of your situation, and it's about weighing both the financial and non-financial considerations. So what we'll do is start with a high-level overview, walk through some of the pros and cons of leasing, explain the pros and cons of buying, and based on that discussion, we'll tie it all together by sharing our overall thoughts on which option is best for which situations. So Andrew, hopefully you'll come away from this with a really good idea of whether you should buy or lease that beautiful new minivan we talked about a couple episodes ago.
Oh, come on. Low blow here.
I just wanted to make sure the excitement was still there.
Excitement, acceptance, same thing, right?
Hey, it's progress either way. Well, why don't you start us out with a general overview of the options when getting a new car?
Sure. And this is going to be a very basic overview, but we like to start with being on the same page. So when it comes to getting a new car, you have two basic options. You can either buy the car or lease it. When buying the car, you're the one who actually takes ownership of it, while when leasing, you're effectively renting the car. With buying a car, similar to buying a house, there are different options in terms of how you can actually go about doing it and how much you can put down as a down payment. You could pay for the car 100% in cash, put a 10% down payment and borrow the rest, put down a 50% down payment, or any combination between. It's up to you, and there's flexibility here. With leasing a car, there are also different options and flexibility, but generally speaking, there are a few key items you'll need to make decisions about. These include the length of the lease, most commonly 2 to 3 years, the number of miles you want to be able to drive each year, often 10 to 12,000, but this can be flexible, and the amount of money, if any, you'll put down up front for the lease. The choices you make here will collectively determine the cost of the lease and what your monthly payment will be to rent the car over the time period. So as you can see, while it's a straightforward question of should I buy or lease, there are nuances within each of the two options, but that's a general overview of the two routes you can go when getting a new car. And as a quick side note on the process of getting a car, as many of you probably know firsthand, going to the dealership to buy a car tends to be one of the worst consumer experiences. It's probably somewhere between going to the DMV and dealing with your cable company. And because of that, you're often led into having to quote-unquote play the game a little bit. Otherwise, you may be overpaying. So rather than just going to the dealership to both test drive cars and negotiate the price and financing, it's often better to split things up. So go into the dealership to see the cars and test drive them to decide which model you want. Then once you decide on the exact car, just email a few different dealerships in the area to see what's the best price they can offer on that model, whether that's the price for buying the car or the cost to lease it. This allows you to do a price comparison and settle on the final price on your terms from the comfort of your home without having to experience the pressure, games, and wasted time that can come with trying to negotiate pricing in person at the dealership.
Oh, come on. Don't leave out going to the dentist. It's one of those amazing consumer experiences.
How could I forget about that one?
Hopefully they'll let it slide. So the two options are to buy or lease, but which one is better? We'll start with leasing and walk through some of the pros and cons of it to give you a sense of that approach. As mentioned earlier, when thinking about this decision, there are both financial and non-financial considerations, and we'll start out with one of the biggest non-financial benefits of leasing, which is being able to get a new car every couple years. Many people love the idea of driving a new car, whether it's because they like having the latest technology, the latest safety features, or just the feeling of having a new car or the image that goes along with it. There's also the practical consideration of knowing you have a dependable car that's less likely to experience issues or need big repairs. Well, leasing fits this perfectly, as the vast majority of leases are 2 to 3 years, which means you're never driving the car for too long before reaching the end of your lease term and being able to trade in for another new car, assuming you choose to lease again. Following along the same lines of always being able to drive a new car, leasing also tends to provide more convenience and fewer hassles for a few reasons. One of them is the repairs aspect I just mentioned. Knowing that your car is new, the probability of it needing big repairs and you having to take it in for service and the related disruption is low. Furthermore, if you do have that unlikely scenario of needing a big repair, based on the length of most leases, the car will likely still be under the manufacturer's warranty during the lease period, and therefore you probably won't have to pay for the cost of any repairs, compared to a 7-year-old car that you own and that needs a repair. And as a side note, one other thing to keep in mind is that some leases include free oil changes and other maintenance, so this can mean less money you're having to pay out of pocket for the routine maintenance that's required for all cars. The convenience aspect also extends to the end of the lease when you're ready to get a different car, where once your lease is up, you can simply drop the car off at the dealership and move into another lease for another new car, as opposed to if you own a car and reach the point of wanting to get a different one, you have to then go through the hassle of reselling your car or negotiating a trade-in value for it with the dealership. Although it's worth noting that there are a number of companies that have popped up over the years, such as Carvana, that have made the process of reselling your car much easier and more profitable than trying to go through the dealership to trade it in. Another benefit of leasing is the monthly cost. Not the lifetime total financial cost, which we'll cover in a bit, but just the cost in terms of how much money you have to pay each month to drive the vehicle. Generally speaking, your monthly lease payment will be lower than your monthly car payment if you bought the vehicle. The reason why is that when you lease a car, you're effectively paying for the depreciation of the car during the lease term, plus an interest charge, whereas when you buy a car and take out a car loan, you're paying back principal on the loan each month, plus the interest charge as well. Because of this dynamic, and depending on the length of the car loan, for the same monthly cash out the door, you're able to drive a nicer car by leasing compared to buying, or for the same car, have lower cash out the door by leasing. Somewhat related to the lower monthly cash flow costs, leasing also has a lower upfront cost. When buying a car, even if you borrow money for the purchase, you're required to pay some amount of money as a down payment up front, typically 10 to 20%. With a lease, on the other hand, while you have the option of putting money down up front, which would lower your monthly lease payment, you aren't required to, and therefore leasing is less of a financial commitment up front if you don't have the cash available. So those are some of the pros of leasing, and as you can see, there's a lot to like about the idea of leasing. But Andrew, why don't you cover some of the drawbacks to give the full picture?
Sure. So as Trent just mentioned, when you lease a car, you're essentially paying for the depreciation of the car plus an interest charge. Cars depreciate the fastest during their initial years of life, aka it's already worth less the second you drive a car off the lot. And since most leases are 2 to 3 years, you're paying for the depreciation during the period where the car is depreciating most rapidly. Looking at the numbers, new cars tend to depreciate by at least 10% the minute you drive them off the lot, and to make things even better, they then continue to depreciate by around 10% per year for the next 5 years before slowing down after that. Therefore, if you can compare the total cost of buying a car and driving it for 10 years and then selling it to the cost of getting 5 back-to-back 2-year leases over that same time period, the cost of leasing is going to be much higher. So while for the same car, the monthly cash out the door is going to be higher for buying rather than leasing, the total lifetime financial cost for leasing is going to be higher. Because you're continuing to trade in the car every 2 to 3 years, pay the depreciation costs during the highest depreciation years, and at the end of it, you won't be left with an asset that you own and are able to sell, albeit at a much lower value than you bought it. Therefore, really the biggest downside to leasing versus buying is the total financial cost over the course of the car's life. Now, having said that, this assumes if you bought the car instead of leasing it, you would continue to drive it for a long time, say 10 or more years. If, on the other hand, you chose the buying route but continued to buy a new car every few years, then the math would change and buying would no longer be the clear-cut choice in terms of being the quote-unquote financially optimal over the long term. In addition to the lifetime financial costs, there are some other drawbacks to keep in mind with leasing. One of them is mileage limits. As I mentioned earlier, when you lease a car, it comes with a certain annual mileage limit, say 10,000 or 12,000 miles. Now, you're certainly allowed to drive more than that, but if you exceed the lease's mileage limit, when you go to turn in the car at the end of the lease, you're required to pay a penalty for the extra miles you drove, as much as 50 cents per mile. So this can feel a little restrictive or frustrating if you end up having to drive more miles than the lease limit. Another downside of leasing is that if you continue to lease, you'll always have a monthly car payment. By contrast, when you buy a car, most car loans are around 5 years, so you only have a payment during that time, but once the car is paid off, you no longer have a monthly car payment and can continue to drive the car for as long as you want. Now, you'll eventually have to replace the car at some point, and when you do, you'll have that car payment again, but you'll at least get to enjoy, from a financial perspective, those periods later in the car's life where the loan is paid off and you don't have a car payment each month. Lastly, when you lease a car, you're also required to take good care of it because you'll have to pay an excess wear and tear charges when you turn it in. This won't be an issue for some people, but if you have kids at younger ages, or if you happen to get a bunch of dents and dings in parking lots, this could be an extra cost for you and could provide extra stress compared to if you own the car and the stakes are lower, since the only impact would be on your enjoyment of the vehicle and the potential resale value down the road.
Wait, you don't think kids would ever explode Costco applesauce pouches all over the ceiling of their family's Chrysler Pacifica minivan? Or drop their entire bowl of melted frozen yogurt with all the toppings face down on the van's floor, do you?
Those all seem incredibly oddly specific and personal examples.
Well, let's just say Jed and I are glad we own it rather than leasing it.
Well, come on. Who wouldn't want to own a nice, fully loaded minivan?
Glad you're coming around to minivan life there.
Slowly.
So Andrew just shared the other side of the coin of leasing, and hopefully you have a good picture of what it looks like. So now we're going to shift gears to buying, and I'll start with the positives. By far the biggest potential benefit of buying is that, under the right circumstances, it tends to be the financially optimal decision in terms of minimizing your lifetime cost. As Andrew mentioned, these quote-unquote right circumstances are when you buy the car and drive it for a long time, say 5 to 10 years or more. And the way the math works, the longer you drive the vehicle, the more the numbers work in your favor, which makes sense if you think about it because after a certain period of time, typically 5 years, the vehicle will be paid off, and at that point, your only quote-unquote cost is the annual depreciation of the asset you now own. And as mentioned earlier, cars tend to depreciate faster during their early years and slower during their later years, so this cost becomes fairly small. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're focusing solely on the financial side of the equation and minimizing cost, the optimal approach is to buy a car and then drive it as long as possible until it eventually becomes uneconomical to repair. Now, as we've already shared, there are many other factors to consider beyond just the financial aspects, but lifetime financial cost is one of the biggest benefits of buying over leasing, so we wanted to start with that when talking about the pros. Another advantage of buying is that you have total flexibility over how you use your car. If driving 10,000 miles per year best fits your situation and your needs, that's great. But if driving 30,000 miles is better, that's no big deal because unlike a lease, you don't have a set mileage number you're trying to stick to. So this can provide some nice peace of mind knowing you won't be charged extra if you drive more miles. Buying also allows you to build equity in an asset since you're actually taking ownership of the car. In some ways, it's like the difference between renting and buying a home. Although a big distinction to make here is that a home is an appreciating asset whose value increases over time, whereas a car is a depreciating asset whose value declines over time. So you'd never want to view buying a car as an investment, but even so, when you're done paying off your car loan, you walk away with an asset you own that does have value, even if that value will steadily decline over time, compared to a lease where you walk away with nothing. Lastly, you also have more flexibility down the road when buying a car. Once your loan is paid off and you own the car outright, you have many different options. You can continue driving it for as long as you want, you can trade it in and use the value to reduce the cost of the next car you buy, you can sell it outright, or you can give it to a family member if you want. You get to decide. With a lease, however, you know that at the end of the 2 or 3 year term, you'll have to either get a new lease or buy a car at that time.
Yeah, it makes me think of the first car I owned. A nice, beautiful 2009 Ford Taurus, and one of those kick yourself moments you can laugh at. Because when I went to trade it into the dealership, it had over 200,000 miles on it, and they offered me, wait for it, a full $500. And on the way in, I needed gas, so out of habit, I filled up the gas tank for $50, which means I gave up 10% of the sales price just like that.
I'm still laughing that filling up your gas tank was a 10% reduction in your profit. Although, in your defense, who would have thought a tank of gas could be worth a tenth of what an entire car is worth?
Thank you. See, there you go. You can't win them all, but at least I came out ahead financially with the car.
Yeah, absolutely.
So shifting gears, I'll touch on the downside of buying, outside of any regrets about filling up the gas tank before you sell the car. And it's pretty straightforward, at least financially, that the biggest downside is just the uncertainty and unknowns around repairs and maintenance that come with owning a car. When you lease a car, there doesn't tend to be much risk here since the car is new and is likely still covered by the manufacturer's warranty throughout the time you drive it. So if there does happen to be a big mechanical issue, you likely won't have to pay anything out of pocket. With buying, on the other hand, assuming you're going to drive the car for more than a few years, you'll eventually get to the point where the car is no longer under warranty and eventually starts needing periodic repairs, as all cars do. There are a couple things to keep in mind here. One, if you own the car, you're the one responsible for paying the repairs, which can be costly. And two, eventually you'll get to the point where repairs and issues become more frequent, and you'll eventually face a difficult decision of trying to decide whether or not it's worth paying for an incremental repair versus throwing in the towel on the car and buying a new one. There's often an uneasy feeling of going to the mechanic and thinking about car repairs. Do you really need all the repairs they're suggesting? Is there another dealership that would give a better deal? And that's all on top of the coordination with scheduling repairs in general. So it's not usually an enjoyable experience. So the key point here is that with buying, you're the one who's responsible for maintaining and fixing the vehicle over time. And while the likelihood of having issues with the car and needing bigger repairs can vary, this is a potential risk with buying, and and is one of the reasons some people opt for the peace of mind of leasing instead. Another risk of buying is the fact that technology in the auto industry continues to change so rapidly. Not only the technology within a given car, but also bigger picture dynamics like the gradual shift we're seeing toward electric cars. The situation today is much different than it was 5 years ago, not to mention 10 years ago, which, rest in peace, the luxury 5-disc CD changer. And if you own a car, you know its value will decline over time, but there's also the uncertainty and risk that the value could decline at a different rate than you're expecting it if you're planning to drive the car for 10 years or more. And you may only end up selling your car for $500 like me. And the last downside around buying is a first world problem, but has varying degrees of importance based on each person. As we mentioned, the math works out in your favor if you buy a car and drive it long enough, with the key part being that you drive your car long enough and have additional months without a car payment. Because of that, you inevitably forfeit the frequency at which you will have a new car. So again, no right or wrong answer here, but if you buy a car and want to make a smart financial decision, this means you will routinely be driving cars that aren't always carrying the latest bells and whistles that come out each year.
Or if you're like us, it doesn't matter because we only use 2 or 3 features of our cars.
Yeah, I will say having gone 11 years without a new car, you learn to appreciate these new features.
It's the little things, right?
Exactly.
So now that we've laid out the pros and cons of both buying and leasing, what's our overall perspective in terms of which option is better? Well, as you can tell, there are trade-offs here in terms of the purely financial side and the qualitative side, and it comes down to the nature of the situation. But to provide some general guidelines, the biggest thing to understand in terms of dollars and cents is that the financially optimal approach tends to be buying a car and then driving it for as long as possible until it becomes uneconomical to repair. This is going to save you the most money over the long run. So it's great to know this, and it probably makes intuitive sense, but the next question then becomes, well, what if I don't want to just buy a car and drive it into the ground? If this is the case, it comes down to timeline and how long you plan to drive the vehicle. If you're planning to drive it for only a few years before getting a new one, then leasing is probably the better option. Whereas if you're planning to drive it for 5 years or more, the math tends to shift in favor of buying instead of leasing. So that's the financial side of things. But as we know, there are other important factors to consider that have nothing to do with money. In this case, the biggest one is how much you value being able to always be driving a new car. If you're someone who really likes driving a new car, whether for technology, safety, or simply feeling reasons, you might decide it's worth it to lease rather than buy, even if you know that it'll cost you more financially in the long run. If that's the situation, it's okay, just as long as you understand the trade-offs, value always having a new car, and can afford the higher lifetime financial cost. So we've covered timeline for driving the car and preference for driving a new car versus having an older car, but one last thing to consider is how much you drive. Leased cars have mileage limits, and even a high mileage lease might only have a limit of around 20,000 miles a year. So if you're someone who drives 30,000 miles or more, then leasing likely won't even be an option for you since you won't be able to find a lease with that mileage limit, so buying will be the natural choice. Well, that covers our breakdown of the pros and cons of buying versus leasing, and hopefully you now have a good understanding of the two and which one makes the most sense for you. This is another one of those million things in financial planning where there isn't necessarily a black and white answer, and instead it depends on the specifics of your situation and how much you value the financial side of the equation versus some of the qualitative aspects of the decision. To give a quick recap of some of the key points we covered, number 1, the 2 basic options when getting a new car are to buy it or lease it. When you lease it, you're effectively renting the car for a certain period of time, typically 2 to 3 years, whereas when you buy it, you take actual ownership of the car as an asset. Number 2, some of the biggest benefits of leasing include being able to regularly get a new car, the convenience of not having to worry as much about repairs or maintenance, the simplicity of it and not having to worry about reselling or trading in your car at the end of the lease, and the lower burden on monthly cash flow, since compared to buying, leasing typically involves less money up front and a lower monthly car payment. Number 3, the biggest downside of leasing is lifetime financial cost, since it costs more to continue to lease a new car every 2 to 3 years than it does to buy a car and drive it for many years. Other downsides of leasing include mileage restrictions, where you have to pay a penalty if you drive more than the miles allowed in your lease, the fact that you'll always have a car payment if you lease, and greater responsibility for taking care of the car, since you'll have to pay extra money when you turn it in at the end of the lease if there's excess wear and tear beyond what's considered normal during the time. Number 4, shifting gears to buying, the biggest benefit is that if you plan to drive the car for 5 to 10 years or more, you'll come out ahead financially compared to leasing. Other advantages include the freedom to drive the car as many miles as you want, the fact that by buying, you're building equity in an asset, albeit a depreciating one, and greater flexibility down the road where you aren't forced to get another new car in 2 to 3 years, like with a lease, and can instead choose among more options for what to do next. Number 5, on the other hand, some of the downsides of buying include the fact that you're required to handle all maintenance and repairs, which can become more of a challenge over time as the car gets older, the uncertainty of what the car will be worth 5 or 10 years down the road, given how quickly the car industry is changing, and less ability to get a new car every few years, since that doesn't make financial sense when buying. And lastly, number 6, whether to buy or lease depends on the situation, but as a general rule of thumb, the financially optimal approach is to buy the car and drive it for a long time, in theory, until it becomes uneconomical to repair. However, if you're someone who likes being able to get a new car every few years, you can decide whether you value that more than the incremental cost of leasing, and if you do, that's okay. Well, thank you to everyone for joining us for another episode of the show. As always, you can find the show notes at the podcast page of our website, mdwmllc.com/podcast. And if you have thoughts to share or questions you'd like to have answered, please feel free to email us at info@mdwmllc.com. Take care, everyone, and we'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
Want even more ideas, tools, and resources on how to make smart financial decisions? Check out the resources section of MD Wealth Management's website at mdwmllc.com, where you'll find additional knowledge and insight from Michigan physicians, including a blog, ebook, and one-page guides. While there, you can also schedule a 15-minute conversation with Andrew and Trent to learn more about what it means to work with the firm and how they serve physicians. If you've enjoyed the content, please leave a review on iTunes and share with your friends and colleagues. Thanks so much for listening. Andrew Mushbaugh and Trent DeBruin are certified financial planners, principals, and co-founders of MD Wealth Management, a registered investment advisory firm in the state of Michigan. All opinions shared in the show are for general information and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future returns. Please consult with your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before making any decisions.